Welcome to the Educational Physics Podcast. I am your host, João Figueiredo. This is Season 3 of the Educational Physics Podcast. I hope to speak about many issues. I hope to speak to guests about many issues. And I hope that we together can discuss the future of education in an honest and open way. Please consider subscribing, sharing, liking, and commenting. Your support is much appreciated. Thank you. Welcome to another episode of the Educational Physics Podcast. We continue our journey through learner-centered education, and today I bring to you the third angle that I want to tackle this from: philosophy. If you followed the second season of this podcast, you'll know that I'm very passionate about philosophy. I try to think about all things in life really at as broad a scale as I can. And I believe that is ultimately what philosophy is all about. It's to think about the meaning of things at the largest scale you can think of. Now, that can be a difficult task for specific topics, such as learner-centered education. You think that if you're trying to find the perfect way to teach one student at a time in a way that allows that student to blossom and grow and thrive, then you think that to think at a large scale is precisely the opposite of what one must do. But the reality is that thinking philosophically will allow us to understand the human nature side of things when it comes to learner-centered education. How do humans learn? We talked about the evolutionary angle. We've talked about the psychological angle. And today we'll talk about the philosophical angle. In this case, I'm going to choose possibly my favorite philosopher, Socrates. And I'm going to use his model for education to once again defend learner-centered education and really make my case for it. One of the things that Socrates was very famous for was he was a very inquisitive person. So one of his, theories was that people didn't really learn new information. All we did was remember information. We would reminisce and recall information that we had already acquired in past lives. Now, we have to put this into the context of the time, right? So you might say, yeah, that's nonsense. No one's remembering anything from past lives. And to be fair, you're probably right. What Socrates was witnessing, though, and again, within the context of the time, perhaps he couldn't really explain it the way that would fit our current models. But he was still on point when it comes to something quite interesting that happens when you know how to ask questions. Typically, people will get to the answer that you're looking for. And you might think, how is that possible if that person was never told the answer? And this is what Socrates would call reminiscing. This person can get to the answer because the answer is already in there, and I'm just basically pulling the answer out of them by means of questions. Let's look at this from a different perspective, right? So translating this to what was really happening was obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but what was happening is that Socrates was so good at asking questions that he would ask effectively leading questions, right? And so the person being inquired would sort of put the pieces together by understanding the question clearly and by pulling from things that they already knew and the wording of the question, they would get to the answer. Now, Socratic, or the Socratic inquiry model is quite interesting because it really teaches people how to word questions in a way that still allows the student, in this case, to get to the answer by themselves. Now, let's quickly discuss why this is good. It's good for motivational purposes because the person is now feeling empowered by their own discoveries, and so they should. There's no cheating here. It's good because it teaches people the skill, which is to understand the question. You'd be surprised by how many times I ask my students questions and then they give me an answer that is really like completely apparently random, and then when I ask them to, because my initial instinct immediately is to go like, okay, what do you think I asked you? And I ask them to repeat the question back to me, and the question comes back completely different. It's almost like playing a one-on-one game of Chinese whispers, which with just a one person, that shouldn't happen. We shouldn't lose the message. So what is happening? Well, two things potentially are happening, right? The quality of my question is poor. The wording might be not formulated correctly for that student. The question I'm asking, if we now take a tangent and speak a little bit about Vygotsky, maybe the question I'm asking is above that student's cognitive ability to process. So I need to change the wording. I need to bring the question down to the stage of development that they are in. And the second option, of course, and sometimes these two overlap, by the way, is that, okay, maybe my question is worded correctly, but the student has a bias, and in this case, like almost like a cognitive blindness to the subject. And if that's the case, then we must then start to explore where that bias is. Because if you ask a question that, even if the answer is wrong, let's imagine they should give you a qualitative, let's say a quantitative answer like a number, but instead they give you a qualitative answer like an emotion, then clearly they didn't quite understand the question. And that happens quite a bit in music lessons, right? You ask a student about the value of a certain note, and then suddenly they answer you not in a numerical way. So when you ask for the value, it should be a number. Now the number, if they give you the wrong number, that's fine. We'll sort that out, but they clearly understood the question. They just, okay, they didn't get to the answer yet. But when they answer in, using I guess a category of answers that doesn't even fit the question, then clearly the question was misunderstood, which is also fine. And then the next process then has to be, okay, what do you think you heard? So repeat the question back to me. And when they do, and you realize that, okay, yeah, they're not really understanding the question, they are translating it onto something else, we'll then have to, address that. We help them understand, like, when I ask this, what do you think that means? Can you explain the meaning of that word? And what does that word mean? And you'll have to unpack the question into smaller questions. Again, the Socratic inquiry system or model will tell you that the quality of the questions and the sequence of the questions is key. for success in this kind of interaction. If we don't know, as the questioner, if we don't know how to pose the questions, and maybe our phrasing is sloppy, or we give out not bad clues, but again, the wording must have in itself embedded the answer in a way. That's kind of the trick, isn't it? That's why we call them leading questions. That's why leading questions can also be harmful, because we end up falling into this trap of the power of suggestion, right? We almost don't allow people to think for themselves, because we kind of create a little verbal trap where they have to give you the answer you're looking for. If that's done with good intentions, then I guess that's the whole point, right? You're supporting them by asking questions and they get to the answers. So there you go. You have the motivation that comes from it. They feel very empowered. They don't feel like they were just, force-fed answers. To think about the wording is where the hard work is at. As an educator, you'll have to spend enough time practicing your skill for asking questions. You'll have to ponder on the phrasing. You'll have to think about even the length of the question. It becomes too long-winded, you're going to lose them. If it's too short, too vague, there's not enough information. So the dose has got to be just right. And that's quite difficult. When dealing with children, we have to understand as well that each stage of development requires different approaches. And both in teaching or in parenting, it's all a matter of stages, right? Your parenting skills or your educator skills have to be adapted to the child in front of you. In my case, once again, using my own personal experience, whether you relate to it or not, we shall see. But I teach all sorts of ages. I could be teaching a 53-year-old at 10 a.m. And then I'm going to be teaching a 7-year-old at 11 a.m. Right? It changes all the time. And I have to constantly adapt the level of the questions, the kind of questions, the depth of the questions, how much intensity I can bring into the inquiry process. Now I'm going to bring another name into this. One of my favorite thinkers of this time, who also believes in the power of inquiry, but unlike Socrates, doesn't really put it down to a remembering process of past lives and experiences, and that your soul basically lives on and is just taking on new bodies, but that soul carries knowledge, and therefore when you're asked questions about that knowledge, basically you're poking at the soul and the answers come out. And it might look like that's the case. So many times with my child, I've said to him jokingly, I ask a question and sometimes he tells me, oh, I don't know, which sometimes it's a defense mechanism, right? It's just deflection. Oh, I don't know, which translates to just leave me alone. and then I ask him to squeeze his brain. Now, first of all, you cannot squeeze your brain. And second of all, yes, you can, force yourself to concentrate and perhaps some synapses will fire. But the answer, when it comes, and sometimes it does come, which is quite interesting, comes precisely from a willingness to find the answer, right? So if the answer is somewhere there, or if we have enough information to connect enough dots to create a new answer, but that it's a compounding of, not compounding, but I guess a compilation of of many different knowledges, which is, again, fundamentally your brain is firing synapses and connecting dots. And poof, there comes the answer. Is that a remembering? Is that a creation? Is that what imagination is all about? It's a constant connection of dots that allows us to think ahead of what we know today, right? Is that what imagination is? It's definitely a creative process. And so this other person that I want to bring into this conversation is Gabor Mate. And if you don't know who Gabor Mate is, please do Google him and go watch his lectures on YouTube. And he's an absolutely fascinating thinker. And he's got this model for inquiry that he calls compassionate inquiry. Basically, stems from the same ideas that you can ask your way through self-understanding or understanding of someone, right? You can do that and support that person's self-discovery through questions rather than giving them instructions and answers and this and that, which can be very frustrating for a lot of people. And I can appreciate why. It's the force feeding that I was talking about earlier, right? It just feels like you're not really coming up with your own knowledge. Someone is just forcing you into a certain way of thinking. And who likes that, right? Some people feel compelled to respect that because they see someone else as authority, but that's not what I would consider education, right? So if we are fighting that, then we have to drive and lead by example and lead by inquiry. So compassionate inquiry is when you ask the questions, you talk about, and you get the person to find their own answers, but always with an awareness. So this is extremely important if you're a parent or an educator of any kind. It doesn't matter if you teach music, if you teach dance, if you teach maths, if you teach jiu-jitsu. You have to understand that everyone has their limits. Everyone has their triggers. There's a potential for re-traumatization if you don't understand what questions to ask and when and how. Everyone has their sensibilities, and it is crucial that you support this person during that process. If you're teaching someone how to execute, a dance step, and you can tell that they are feeling more and more overwhelmed, they can't remember the steps, it feels like everything is too much. Now, in your head, you have to understand this. That person's cognitive capacity is reducing by the millisecond. Every time they find themselves in that I'm failing position, they crash even further. Their cognitive skills crash even more. So it gets more and more difficult for them to retain information. Memory works in a very specific way, and under stress, we get good at reacting to things, but we don't get good at remembering things. And this is just human nature, which is why the philosophical approach is so useful. So the Socratic inquiry process plus this Gabor Mate's compassionate inquiry model all brought together, where you have, okay, on one hand, this trust in the other person's capacity for discovering and sort of imagining an answer, because that's what it is, on the basis of the wording for your question, which reminds us of that old saying, which is, in the essence of a problem lies the solution. It's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Because if you have a problem and you can define it well, you will find the solution right there. Because if you can define the problem, well, for starters, you will immediately know what not to do. Well, that could well be a solution, or at least the start of the solution. With the Socratic way of asking questions, that's the same thing. You're embedding in the questions the way to the answer. But you're allowing the person to do the thinking. This is what's crucial, right? Socrates himself said famously, one of his many quotes, that education should be the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel. So we're not trying to fill up a vessel with lots of knowledge, but instead light up a flame inside people's spirits and minds. And then Gabor Mate's take on it, where yes to all of that, whilst also supporting the person you're asking questions to in the processing of those emotions, especially if you're dealing with trauma. You're going to have to be very careful. If you're dealing with stimuli overwhelm, or stimuli overload, not overdose, but overload. If you're dealing with that, then you have to be very watchful, and you have to understand, okay, this person is starting to feel overwhelmed. I can see it, I can sense it. Depending on the age of the person, you might want to just address it straight away and ask them, okay, tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what's going through your mind as you're experiencing these emotions. And let them speak. And sometimes it's going to be very difficult for them to express it. It's going to be very difficult for them to be honest. They will start by using defense mechanisms. They might deny it, they might refuse to acknowledge its seriousness, some people just laugh it off. And compassionately, our jobs is to say, you're safe here. I'm not going to judge you. There's no wrong answers. I'm not going to punish you. You'd be surprised with how many 50-year-olds still need to hear, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not here to punish you. And you're safe here. So as an educator, you're holding space for that person to express themselves. And then you need to understand the importance of that moment. And you need to respect it. Let them talk or let them not talk. That's the compassion side of things. Wait until you ask the next question. Let them process it. That vulnerability that you are exposing them to is very costly to them. And in the learner-centered education model, there's a lot that can feel dangerous. There's a lot that can feel threatening. Some students don't want to be in the spotlight. And now you're saying that, hey, I'm focusing on you. It's tough. So we must be compassionate. We must be patient. We must be understanding that, again, people have their limits. And sometimes all they need is reassurance and comforting, and then follow that up with an understanding as to how you need to address that person specifically. How would they like or prefer for you to deliver their information? Maybe they just need to be shown it one more time. Maybe they just need you to actually ask them questions. Like I said earlier, can you please repeat the question back to me? And by doing that, you allow them to regain control over the situation, because now it's going to be at their pace. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to allow people to learn at their pace, as long as it is beneficial for them. That's my philosophical take on this. People are unique. And we do have this wonderful capacity for imagination. And we have this wonderful capacity to connect with this sort of collective consciousness, as Carl Jung would say. And if we can, we as parents / educators or trainers, coaches, whatever you are, if you're teaching people, children or adults alike, understand that you have to be sensitive to the limits, but also the capacity for expansion of human nature. Allow people to trust their own ability to go out there and conquer more unknown territory within themselves. Trust them to do so whilst staying attentive, compassionate, patient, and curious. Stay curious, because if you stay curious, they will too. That closes this episode of the Educational Physics Podcast. Thank you once again for listening. I truly appreciate your attention and support. As always, please subscribe, share, like, comment. Ask me any questions you might have. Let's start a conversation. In the meantime, take care, learn better, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.